Hello everyone, this is Eric Richter, and in my project I will be covering strategies for teaching pronunciation to English language learners. We will specifically be talking about motivational factors, as that was all I was able to cover in this portion of my research. I performed more of a case study, which was qualitative, using interviews and um, some surveys to look at what factors students found um, appealing both in a tangible result fashion and a um, fun or stimulating manner. In the future, I'd like to perform more of a quantitative study to look at what actual lasting effects different pronunciation strategies have. But for now, this was the introductory step. In my teaching context, I am not the main teacher, but am only a volunteer among many other volunteers. Our class is roughly a 1-to-1 volunteer to student ratio, and we are very limited on time spent with students. We really only meet um, throughout the college semester once per week for about a 2-hour session. Um, as a result, we really need to look at what factors are going to make students seek out ways of improving their pronunciation on their own outside of the classroom. And that really inspired a lot of our research questions. Since most of the students are fairly high level, we do not focus much on grammar in this class, but pronunciation, as students have found that they struggle to articulate in a way that other students or their professors even can understand at times, whereas they actually possess a lot of academic knowledge and understand the linguistics, the vocabulary, the grammar that is used, that they're just not able to articulate it. So our research questions as a result are that um, since our strategies employed in our classroom are very simplistic due to the volunteer aspect and very limited based on the time, we came up with these questions. What kind of activities help with different aspects of pronunciation? This could include phonemes on the individual level, stress within individual words, rhythm, which is stress across phrases or sentences, and intonation or pitch shifts. What are some strategies that promote self-reflection on pronunciation skills? And which activities are students most likely to engage in on their own or to seek out? And how does student perception of individual strategies impact their long-term application of these strategies? So that one we'll have to answer with looking back at what students do with this. These were mainly looking at what kind of factors kept students engaged and what made them feel like it was less of a waste of time. Other questions were identified, but these were most pertinent to this step in our study. We will later look at the quantitative aspect and see what we can find actually worked, like I said before. Our limitations, due to the length of the study, were a big factor that required us to look at the motivational part and take a case study rather than trying to take a large amount of data. I think in the future I will use pre-testing and post-testing of the students to determine where they are before the study and what kind of effects they have from different types of pronunciation instruction strategies. But for now, we just looked at at 3 different students and asked them for some of their perceptions through interviews and questionnaires, as you'll see. I felt that even in finding better strategies to employ, they might be ineffective due to the amount of time that I get to spend with students. The students need to be able to employ the strategies on their own time if they want to find significant improvement in their pronunciation skills. Quantitative data might be more effective for demonstrating which ones had a more potent effect, but for this study I decided to go with the qualitative analysis using more interviews and extensive surveys to attain a thorough understanding of the English language learner perceptions of these strategies. Even with these questionnaires and interviews, 3 is kind of a small number. I went with just a case study, but really I think I would like to take more data even for this step, just to have a more rounded perception from people of different levels of language learning, skill, like where they're at on a skill level, and even on an academic level, because my students were mainly PhD level, and we also have some bachelor level students, or those who are just beginning their collegiate studies. The literature review is the most helpful aspect of this study, in my opinion, just due to the limitation of data that I was able to collect. However, the literature really pointed to a lot of different theoretical understandings, as pronunciation is very complex. I found several general suggestions of what types of strategies to look for, and this really helped to formulate my process for what we were actually going to look at. Pronunciation is a fairly young research topic, having its start only in the late 1800s. After the International Phonetic Alphabet was created in 1886, linguists began looking at distinctions between different phonic systems of various languages. Pronunciation instruction was debated for a long time as to its importance, but over the 1900s, it would come in and out of popularity, and it's finally at the point where they said that pronunciation is very related to communication and is obviously therefore important and necessary to teach. As I said about my students, they have very high language skills in the grammar and vocabulary aspects. Some of them exceeding me even in their own fields, obviously, of engineering, where I cannot keep up. So their vocabulary is fine. Their grammar is also strong and works well for communication, but they may not be able to articulate everything or communicate with the same natural intonation that a native speaker might have, and it leads to confusing sentences even when everything else is right. Pronunciation instruction has long been ignored in the classroom in favor of grammar and vocabulary. Phonic systems can become fossilized due to this, because early in language learning you focus on vocabulary and grammar and ignore pronunciation, and then it fossilizes and is difficult to rewrite the bad habits that are formed. One of the main theories that pronunciation instruction hinges on is the balance between explicit and implicit language learning, because pronunciation generally happens in the background of a speaker's thought process while they're focusing on more meaningful aspects of language. And so we have to think that this needs to be an implicit process, but most pronunciation instruction happens explicitly, as it requires a great deal of mental resources. So we need to find a balance between explicit and implicit through this. Speech can also be broken down into segmentals, which is phonemes, or the smallest unit of speech that can be used to make one word different from another, such as bat and bet. There's only one vowel difference in that whole word. And the suprasegmentals, which includes rhythm, stress, pitch, and intonation, which happen over the course of an entire segment. It could happen through a word, it could happen through a whole sentence, and this is more difficult to isolate. So pronunciation instruction needs to cover both of these, and I think in our context we've mostly focused on segmentals, which has a very limited reward for focusing on that, although it is very tangible and is very explicit. So I put together a multitude of activities that we ran the students through, and asked some questions about them. So for the methodology, I sought to gather data on perceptions of different strategies for teaching and learning pronunciation in the second language. The following steps will be described on later slides in more depth. 1, I recorded an interview of the student or participant. 2, I introduced pertinent vocabulary and that is included on my paper. I did not go into depth in this presentation. There's just too much to talk about. So if you want to look at any of this in depth, I can send you the actual paper that has all of the data and the procedure in much more detail. 3, I demonstrated several pronunciation instruction activities, which was the most grueling of the activities, and you'll see later. And then I used 2 questionnaires and a discussion with the participants to identify and record their views. So the interview, as I mentioned before, I interviewed each participant, covering basic information about the student, such as demographic information, language learning background, and an opportunity to analyze their speech for a later time if I needed to. That would be more pertinent in a later step, but I did not really go into depth with this on this step because I wasn't so much concerned with their actual speech production, but more about their perceptions. None of the students had spent any time when they were learning English working on pronunciation before this class. They learned English in their home countries, which included China and India. 2 of my students were from India and 1 was from China. They both learned English fairly young, but still have these speech issues. Maybe started learning English around 10 years of age, possibly a little later. As the literature had insisted, each of them had focused only on grammar and vocabulary within their classrooms, rather than speech production and recognition. Each had reliable grammar and strong academic vocabulary, but had issues with pronunciation and admitted to having communication difficulties with their peers and professors. Each of the 3 brought this up, which I find is very significant. My second step included introducing pertinent vocabulary, which came up later in the questionnaires, and students really needed to have understanding of important aspects of pronunciation, including phonemes, prosody, stress, rhythm, intonation, explicit and implicit learning, and controlled versus natural settings. If they did not understand these, they would not be able to answer the questionnaire effectively, which I think is something that I need to review and change for later to make more clear, or maybe even focus on a smaller aspect of this. Throughout the study, I would provide clarification of this vocabulary, as it was not expected of the students to remember each of them and their application independently. So I sat with them through the questionnaire out of not looking at their responses as they went, but if they needed me, I was nearby so that I could help. My third and most involved step included the demonstration of pronunciation instruction activities. There were 7 strategies in all, including minimal pair instruction, both on individual words and in sentences. These were separated. Listen and repeat strategies. Corrective feedback in the forms of both recasts and in prompting. The first strategies that were listed are more traditional and might be used in tandem with one another, and in most pronunciation instruction classrooms. I also designed 2 strategies myself, including technology to bring a more multimodal methodology into play. These included visual imitation using a popular phone application called Dub Smash, where students would imitate and record themselves lip syncing to self-selected sound bites from popular media. This would require students to match their mouths up to the sounds of a native speaker. The last activity included video dubbing for student watch, imitate, and where students would have to watch, imitate, and eventually record themselves dubbing their voices onto a YouTube video of a native speaker. Unfortunately, I don't have time in this presentation to go into the details of each of these, but once again, more information is in my paper if you want it, and if not, I can explain it in further detail in the responses later. So please do not hesitate to ask. I want us all to learn. The visual imitation and video dubbing strategies were very fun to put into the practice, if I say so myself. Students very much enjoyed doing them, and we had some peculiar results as as a result of these strategies. So we'll discuss that later. My first questionnaire has students review and answer the same questions about each of the strategies employed. These used a Likert scale of 1 to 5, measuring least effective to most effective, or least helpful to most helpful, on how the students thought individual activities would be. So each of the activities described on the previous slide, the students went through and practiced a little bit with it, and then they would answer about their perceptions afterwards. The questions were divided into sections regarding production and perception of segmentals and suprasegmentals, as well as motivational factors such as willingness to do the activity or how much fun or how stimulating activities would be. This was a very long questionnaire and accompanied by discussion where students needed help or comments that the questionnaire was unable to accurately represent without more words. The second questionnaire was much shorter and only had students list which activities they found most helpful or least helpful, kind of as a superlative, to determine which ones they actually liked the most, rather than just relying on ratings, or most and least engaging or fun. My findings were not quite what the literature had suggested, because most of pronunciation production is an implicit process. The literature suggested that pronunciation instruction really should rely more on implicit learning. Otherwise, students may not put the skills to real-life application. And really that's the goal, is to get students to do this on their own time, since we don't have much time to spend with them. The implicit activities were also rated as being more fun than explicit activities such as minimal pairs. Despite the implicit activities being more interactive and more fun, the participants favored explicit activities over implicit activities because they felt that they were more helpful. So in this regard, we found that students thought that more helpful was more important than fun activities, even if the fun activities may be more actually helpful to them. So students really want to feel like what they're doing matters and is going to make an impact, and that they're not wasting their time. I'd be interested to find out what other students of different disciplinary levels might say regarding this. But it kind of tells me that we need to put both implicit and explicit activities into the curriculum to make sure that students don't feel like they're wasting their time with games, but also have a good balance between naturalistic exposure and classroom explicit drilling. So, in reflection, the literature demonstrated that implicit learning is probably as important or even more so than explicit when it comes to the acquisition of pronunciation skills. Students appreciated explicit learning more. These results indicate that a balance needs to be struck in curriculum and more research must be done. Students must be willing and able to engage in learning activities for long periods of time to adequately acquire pronunciation skills. This means we really need to teach students ways of noticing language forms on their own and be more critical of their own speech so that they can acquire these skills from interaction with peers and professors on campus, as the classroom's just not going to cut it with our small amount of time. Our emerging questions are that, one, what are some ways to better measure perceptions of individual strategies? I feel like we only got a small view because we were looking at too much data, and I would like to get more student responses, but also maybe look at only one or two strategies at a time rather than looking at all 7 in one session. It was somewhat overwhelming and the questionnaire was very long, so this would be better to break up into smaller sessions if I have time. So I will plan on going back and getting more data in the future. Number 2, what balance of activities should be used between explicit and implicit activities to receive a good balance between more engaging activities and more perceptibly tangible results. So students really benefit from the implicit activities more according to the literature, which we'll have to test still, but they prefer to do the explicit tasks that may not be as helpful. So we have to strike a balance to keep them both engaged, communicative, fun, and also feel like they're actually learning something. 3. How can explicit activities such as minimal pair and listening and repeat drills be made more sensorially engaging or fun? These activities are cumbersome and make a student very weary, and also the volunteers, because it requires a high deal of attention, and it's not something you can take out of the classroom. So we need to look at how to make these more accessible outside of the classroom and more engaging to keep them fresh. Our next steps include that in the future, the following steps need to be held to complete and revise this research. Many improvements need to be done to receive better results for this research, primarily using a larger study sample, as I mentioned before, and by simplifying the material. Despite revisals to the current research being necessary, the next step would be to continue to determine the actual effect of these strategies in question through a quantitative study instead. It would also be beneficial to look at ways of revising activities into a more stimulating or multimodal style to promote task longevity. Some of these activities should be incorporated into my classroom to move away from segmental work alone. We're really limited on what we've got actually going, and we need to look at more of the super segmentals, as that's where the students really struggle. This may also involve using more perception increasing tasks within the classroom to promote student recognition outside of the classroom rather than relying on 2-hour sessions every week. For our discussion questions, I'd like to have you answer. For the discussion, please answer the following. 1. What methods have you used or would you use to teach pronunciation to English language learners? Are the methods that you use more explicit or implicit, and do they cover both segmentals and suprasegmentals? How would you make the balance between direct tasks that are more skills-based, more fun, or indirect, that seek to expose and improve noticing of pronunciation? Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Y'all have a wonderful summer.